On October 13, 1972, a plane carrying a rugby team went missing in the Andes Mountains. The search lasted 8 days. Then it was called off. Every newspaper in Uruguay ran the same headline: "No survivors could possibly still be alive up there." They were wrong. 29 people had survived the crash itself, but the mountains they landed in sat over 11,000 feet above sea level, with no food, no radio, and temperatures that dropped to nearly 40 below at night. For 72 days, the outside world believed they were dead. What those 29 people did to become 16 survivors, and what 2 of them did to finally get found, is one of the most well-documented survival stories ever recorded, told almost entirely in the survivors' own words. The passengers were mostly members of the Old Christians Rugby Club, a team from Montevideo, Uruguay, along with their friends and family, chartered to fly to a match in Santiago, Chile. 45 people were on board in total. Bad weather forced the plane to land overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The next afternoon, October 13th, it took off again, planning a route that would skirt around the tallest part of the Andes rather than fly straight through it. The crew misjudged the plane's position. Believing they had already cleared the mountain range, the pilots began their descent towards Santiago. They hadn't cleared it. The plane came down directly into a valley, still deep inside the Andes. It clipped a ridge. The impact tore off both wings and the tail. What remained of the fuselage skidded down a steep, snow-covered slope like a toboggan before finally slamming to a stop. 12 people died in the crash itself, including the pilot and several passengers thrown from the wreckage as it broke apart. Others died from their injuries within the first night. By the next morning, 29 people were still alive, stranded on a glacier at over 11,000 feet, with a broken fuselage as their only shelter. They had almost no food. A few chocolate bars, some wine, a handful of crackers, split among 29 people who had no idea how long they'd be there. What none of them yet knew was that search planes were already flying overhead, and the plane's white fuselage was nearly invisible against the snow. For 8 days, rescue planes searched the mountains. The survivors heard engines overhead more than once and had no way to signal them. On the 8th day, they picked up a transistor radio signal confirming what they'd feared. The search had been called off. Officials had concluded no one could have survived. They were now entirely on their own and running out of food that had never been enough to begin with. Within days, the last of it was gone. The survivors began facing a decision that no calculation of calories or willpower could avoid. Without food, in that cold, at that altitude, none of them would survive long enough to be found. The only source of protein at the crash site was the bodies of the friends and teammates who had already died, preserved almost perfectly by the freezing temperatures. Several survivors, many of them devout Catholics, wrestled openly with the decision for days. Accounts from multiple survivors describe long, difficult conversations about whether this could be reconciled with their faith, and an eventual, painful agreement among the group. If it came to this, each of them consented in advance to the same being done with their own body if they were the ones who didn't make it. It was never framed, by those who lived through it, as an easy choice. It was framed later, by nearly all of them, as the only choice that gave anyone a chance to see their families again. 17 days after the crash, while most of the survivors were sleeping inside the fuselage, an avalanche swept down the mountain and buried it entirely. 8 more people died that night, suffocated in their sleep. The survivors who lived had to dig themselves out through the snow with their bare hands, not knowing at first how many of their friends were still alive beside them. What had already been a survival situation was now, unmistakably, closer to a mass grave with a small number of people still breathing inside it. By late November, an early search party had tried and failed to find a way out, discovering only the plane's separated tail section nearby, with a small amount of extra food and medicine inside. The survivors who remained, down to 16 now, understood that no one was coming to find them. If they wanted to live, someone had to walk out. Two of the strongest among them, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, prepared for an expedition west, over the mountain range, toward Chile. A third survivor, Antonio Vicentin, went with them for the first stretch, before turning back so the food they carried would stretch further for the two who continued. Parado and Canessa set out on December 12th, nearly 2 months after the crash, with a sleeping bag sewn from insulation stripped out of the plane, and rationed scraps of meat to survive the climb. They climbed a mountain with no ropes, no climbing experience, and no map, on the belief, which turned out to be wrong, that Chile would be visible on the other side. Instead, they found only more mountains. They kept walking anyway, for 10 days, across terrain that had killed trained climbers, losing weight they didn't have to lose. On December 20th, they spotted a man on horseback on the far side of a river. It was a Chilean cattle herder named Sergio Catalan. Unable to cross the water or make himself heard over its noise, Parado wrote a message, wrapped it around a stone, and threw it across. It read, in part, that he had come from a plane that crashed in the mountains, and that people were still alive up there, waiting. Catalan rode for hours to reach the nearest police post and raise the alarm. The next day, help arrived for Parado and Canessa. The day after that, helicopters located the 14 other survivors still waiting at the crash site. On December 22nd and 23rd, 1972, 72 days after the crash, all 16 remaining survivors were airlifted out of the Andes. 16 of the 45 people who boarded that plane came home. The other 29 never left the mountain, their remains laid to rest near the crash site, at their family's request, rather than brought down. What happened on that glacier has been retold in books, documentaries, and films for over 50 years, almost always because of the same detail: what they had to eat to survive. But survivors have spent 5 decades saying, in their own words, that the harder part wasn't that decision. It was the 72 days of organizing themselves, rationing what little they had, keeping watch on each other's health, taking turns caring for the injured, and simply choosing, together, not to give up, long after the rest of the world already had. There was no single hero in this story, and no single villain either. There was a search that ended too soon, a mountain range that swallowed a plane whole, and a small group of ordinary young men who had to decide, day after day, for 2.5 months, to keep each other alive anyway. 14 of the 16 survivors are still alive today. Every December 22nd, many of them still meet, together, to mark the day they came home. They didn't survive the Andes because the mountains showed them mercy. They survived because, when everyone outside had stopped looking, they never stopped looking out for each other.